Okay, I want you to picture this. It's the morning of July 8th, 2014, and we're looking at the inside of Varna Airport in Bulgaria. The CCTV cameras are rolling, and they capture a 28-year-old German tourist. For a moment, nothing seems out of the ordinary, but then, suddenly, he bursts into a full panicked sprint. And when you watch this footage, you can literally see the sheer, unadulterated terror in the way this guy is moving. He's looking back over his shoulder wide-eyed. He completely abandons his luggage right there in the middle of the terminal. He doesn't even stop to grab his passport or his cell phone. He just bursts straight through the automatic doors, runs frantically across the parking lot, and actually scales a barbed wire fence that's nearly 2.5 meters high. And then he just vanishes. He runs into a massive field of tall, human-sized sunflowers and just disappears completely. And the craziest part? That chilling, chaotic footage is the absolute last time the world ever saw Lars Mittank. So let's really dive into this. Welcome to This Explainer, where we are going to unpack one of the internet's most famous and, frankly, most unsettling unsolved disappearances. Today, we're going to look closely at the hard facts, the medical records, the incredibly bizarre timeline of his final days, and the prevailing theories surrounding Lars Mittank. Now, to be clear, we aren't going to get into cheap mysticism or paranormal theories here. This is a dark, serious investigation into the tragic and bizarre reality of human behavior. We really have to ask ourselves, was this a devastating psychological break, the unraveling of a human mind in real time? Or did Lars stumble into a very real, very deadly criminal threat? Let's get into it. Part 1, a vacation turned violent. You know, what's really interesting about this case is just how incredibly mundane the timeline starts out. It's June 30th, 2014. Lars and 5 of his friends arrive at the Golden Sands Resort over on the Bulgarian Black Sea coast. If you don't know it, it's a super popular vacation spot for young Europeans. You know the vibe. Beach parties, cheap drinks, just a group of guys looking to blow off some steam. Everything is totally normal for an entire week. But then we hit July 6th. Lars, who is a huge fan of the Werder Bremen soccer club, gets into a verbal altercation at a local sports bar with some fans of a rival team, Bayern Munich. By all accounts, it seemingly started over nothing. Lars was just jokingly swapping the national flags around on the tables. The rival fans leave, the argument seems completely squashed, and everyone goes about their night. But later on, while Lars is alone, grabbing some food near McDonald's, he's jumped. He gets attacked by a group of unidentified men. Now, Lars would later tell his friends he thought these guys were either Russian or Bulgarian locals who had been specifically hired by those rival soccer fans just to teach him a lesson. And the result of this beating? It wasn't just a few bruises. He ended up with a cracked jaw and a severe ruptured left eardrum. This brings us to part 2, the escalating paranoia. Because of that ruptured eardrum, a local doctor gives Lars some pretty strict orders. He absolutely cannot fly. The changes in cabin pressure up in the air would be agonizing and honestly pretty dangerous for his ear. So on July 7th, his friends go ahead and fly back home to Germany, and Lars is forced to stay behind alone. He ends up checking into the Hotel Color. It's a cheap, slightly seedy little hotel in a much rougher part of town, away from the tourist resorts. And this, right here, is where his psychological deterioration rapidly begins. Lars becomes completely consumed by this overwhelming belief that the men who assaulted him at the McDonald's are now actively hunting him down. Hotel staff and witnesses see him pacing nervously. He's reportedly hiding in the hotel elevator for prolonged periods of time. He's leaving the hotel in the dead of the night only to wander back an hour later. It gets to the point where he even becomes convinced that the hotel receptionist is in on this whole conspiracy and has secretly copied his credit card. The paranoia is just off the charts. Which brings us to a series of truly terrifying phone calls. Lars ends up calling his mother, Sandra, back home in Germany, and she immediately notices something is horribly wrong. He is whispering into the phone. His voice is hush, just filled with this absolute suffocating dread. He tells her, "Cancel my credit cards. 4 men are trying to kill me." He even tells her he's hiding up on a roof to stay safe. His mother, who is understandably terrified at this point, tells him she'll book him a bus ticket, a train ticket, literally anything to get him out of that town safely. But despite her trying to help, Lars is completely spiraling out of control. And I think this detail right here brilliantly illustrates his rapidly deteriorating state of mind. At roughly 3 a.m., in the pitch black of his hotel room, Lars sends his mother 2 text messages. The first one simply says, "Cephalzil 500, what is that?" 9 minutes go by, and then he sends the exact same text again. "Cephalzil 500, what is that?" Now, Cefalzil 500 or cefuroxime is literally just the standard antibiotic the local doctor had prescribed him earlier that day for his ear infection, and the doctor had explicitly, clearly explained what it was for. Yet, sitting alone in the dark, Lars is now intensely questioning the very medication he was handed. Is he suspecting that someone swapped his pills? Does he think he's being poisoned? Or is he just completely losing his grip on reality? Part 3. The Doctor and the Stranger. So the next morning, Lars shares a taxi to Varna Airport really early. Both the taxi driver and another passenger in the car would later report to police that Lars looked deeply sick. They said he was visibly fearful, acting super erratic, and had highly dilated pupils. He arrives at the airport terminal around 6 a.m. and calls his mother one last time. He tells her, "They won't let me fly or drive." Now, think about that for a second. It's a completely inexplicable claim. His mother had already booked him travel tickets. Who exactly is they? Seeking medical clearance so he can actually get on a flight, Lars goes into the airport clinic to see the on-duty physician, Dr. Kosta Kostov. And Dr. Kostov later notes that during the exam, Lars seemed emotionally depleted, nervous, and just utterly exhausted. But then, the absolute climax of this entire story happens right inside that tiny medical office. Right in the middle of Dr. Kostov's examination, a man wearing a uniform, who was later described as just a regular airport construction worker, steps into the office. He was literally just popping in to ask the doctor a quick question about some ongoing terminal renovations. But the very second Lars lays eyes on this man, he completely snaps. According to the doctor, Lars instantly begins to tremble. He stammers, backs up, and then screams at the top of his lungs, "I don't want to die here. I have to get out of here." And boom, that brings us right back to that visceral CCTV footage we talked about at the beginning. Lars just bolts. He completely and utterly abandons his identity in that room. His cell phone, his passport, his wallet, his packed luggage, it is all left just sitting there on the floor of the doctor's office. He sprints out of the terminal doors, slows to that frantic jog in the parking lot where he's constantly checking over his shoulder like the devil himself is chasing him, and he scales that barbed wire fence. He disappears into that massive sunflower field, heading out toward a nearby highway and a dense forested area. Part 4. Psychosis or foul play. Okay, let's take a step back and try to ground this in medical reality first. The most widely accepted theory by authorities is that Lars suffered a severe psychological break. Remember, Lars had just suffered a recent head trauma from that beating outside McDonald's. That's a possible traumatic brain injury, or TBI, right there. Now, TBIs might not show up immediately, but when they do, they can absolutely cause intense delirium and paranoia. Then you add the antibiotic he was taking, cefuroxime. If you look at medical journals, they actually note that this specific antibiotic can, in very rare cases, induce acute psychosis, paranoia, and severe hallucinations. This is especially true if it interacts adversely with heavy alcohol consumption, which we know he was at a resort town, or if the person has latent mental health issues like early onset schizophrenia. When you look at it through this lens, the extreme paranoia, the dilated pupils the taxi driver saw, the sheer terror of a random construction worker, it all perfectly matches the profile of a man experiencing a severe, terrifying psychotic break. So, this leaves us with two diametrically opposed theories. On one hand, we have the internal break, an awful, perfect storm cocktail of a concussion, heavy resort drinking, and a rare drug side effect that essentially hijacked his brain. But on the other hand, we have the external threat theories. True crime researchers are quick to point out that dangerous drug syndicates and organized crime absolutely do operate in these resort towns. Some speculate that Lars was actually targeted by organized crime after his fight. There's another much darker theory that suggests the friends who flew back early were actually acting as drug mules, and Lars was held behind as some kind of insurance, which would explain his very real terror at the hotel and the airport. Remember, Lars specifically calmly told his mother that 4 men were actively trying to kill him. We have to ask, was that the paranoia speaking, or was he desperately trying to warn her of a genuine, deadly conspiracy? Part 5. The Unexplained Anomalies. Look, if it was just a psychotic break, it would be tragic, but straightforward. But these are the details that really send chills down your spine. First, the missing CCTV. We obviously have the famous footage of Lars running out of the airport, right? But investigators later noted that footage from earlier in the morning, Lars buying food, washing his face in the bathroom, and crucially, footage of the corridor showing that mysterious construction worker actually entering the doctor's office was inexplicably erased by airport security before the police could secure it. Why would that happen? Second, the cell phone ping. Lars left his phone behind in the doctor's office. We know that.
Yet, telecom specialists later found that his abandoned phone pinged a cell tower in a completely different direction from where Lars ran. And the signal pattern suggested the phone was physically moving, traveling after Lars had already vanished into the sunflowers. And to this day, the phone has never been recovered. And finally, the empty forest. If Lars really just suffered a mental break, wandered blindly into the woods, and sadly succumbed to the elements or his head injuries, well, his body should be there. But despite extensive, massive searches with police cadaver dogs and thermal imaging drones, not a single trace, not even a scrap of his clothing, was ever found in that surrounding area.
Part 6. A Decade of Silence. It's hard to believe, but since July 8, 2014, not a single confirmed trace of Lars Mittank has ever been found. Over a decade has passed now, and there have been false hopes over the years, for sure. There was a truck driver in Germany who was convinced he gave Lars a ride. There was a homeless man found in Brazil who people thought was Lars, but it tragically turned out to be a totally different missing person, a Canadian named Anton Pilipa. But none of these leads ever turned out to be Lars. Despite everything, his mother Sandra still maintains a dedicated Facebook page. She still actively follows up on every single lead that comes in, and she still waits, hoping for her son to finally come home. And I think all of this brilliantly illustrates the lingering, haunting horror of this case. After all this time, we are still left with that final, chaotic image of a young man running for his life into a field of sunflowers. So I want to leave you with this to think about. Was Lars Mittank the tragic victim of a devastating, drug and trauma-induced psychological break that drove him out into the wilderness alone? Or did he somehow stumble into a genuine, terrifying criminal threat that managed to swallow him up without a single trace? Honestly, which theory do you find most plausible? I'd love for you to keep questioning this, keep analyzing the facts, and thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today.